start selling it throughout the colony. They couldn't allow that. They begged the ship's captains to take the tea back to them. But they wouldn't do it. The ships were in the harbor, they signed for it. It's the merchants, it's not us. And the merchants, of course, couldn't bring it ashore, right? They didn't have enough men, they couldn't move it. So essentially, they were stuck. They had to destroy the tea at that moment. Okay, and now, why were they concerned about it landing in Boston that night? The easiest answer, or the easiest explanation, was that Parliament had imposed this tax on tea. That makes sense. But because many people, especially Bostonians, many people thought the tax was reasonable, that it made sense. But a dissident faction of Bostonians believed that Parliament had no right to raise revenue from American colonists without the consent of the colonists. And this was the sticking point. Bostonians worried that if they allowed this, that more taxes would be on the way. They thought if we allowed them to get away with this monopoly situation, Britain owned the plantations where the tea was grown, they owned the companies that shipped it over here, and now they were going to sell it and get all the proceeds from it. Well, wait a minute, what happens to American merchants that sell tea? Well, they get cut out of the business. As I was saying to my friends at the table earlier, I was saying, you know, you couldn't make door hinges, you couldn't make nails, you couldn't make anything, because you had to purchase it from England. That was the trade-off. You know, we found, but they sold us all the hard materials that we needed for day-to-day life. And that was getting very wearisome. And of course, even worse, that this tea would be sold by preferred agents. And what that means is that the company, the British East India Company, would have an entire monopoly at every stage that the tea was sold or shipped. So Parliament had imposed this new arrangement under the Tea Act, which now threatens American merchants by cutting them out of the tea trade. If Parliament could sell tea to America this way and earn revenue from these sales, then the British government could start creating new monopolies on the sale of other products. So right away, colonial merchants, colonial businessmen started to think, well, that would mean exorbitant prices. Once they corner the market, they can charge us anything. And then someone else said, and then these mammoth monopolies will become wealthier and wealthier, and they'll reach into our lives even more. Well, the conclusion was that this type of situation could not work. They couldn't allow it. Well, this fear spread. It spread throughout the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it spread to other colonies too. Colonists were frightened. Not because of what they saw happening in Boston, but because of what they had seen happening throughout the world. Like I said, the story of the Boston Tea Party was not just local, it was global. It affected many places in the world, not just the colonists in Boston. Because like I said, the tea was grown by South Asians, and they made some profit from selling it. And when Europeans and Americans drank tea, they mixed it with sugar, which of course was farmed by enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. They were just those are just some of the historical currents that are attached to the sale of tea. They had to come to grips with all of that. The Boston Tea Party had revolutionary significance. It set the stage for an American rebellion and war that followed. The Tea Party wasn't an expression of a political ideology about taxes and rights and authority. Where does authority come from? Who said you could reach into my life? Why is that okay? And those are the questions they had to face. Just as important, it was a window onto American culture and American society at the time. American consumer habits included this love for tea, And it played a role in this way. And it really affected the way the whole story unfolds. Prevailing views of American Indians, because the colonists that dumped the tea into the harbor painted themselves up, right? And wore headdresses to look like Indians. So you can see there's a lot of ideas, there's a lot of thinking going on among the colonists. Also, you have to take into account that the colonies, especially here in Massachusetts Bay, had a tradition, or they had a culture of popular protest. You don't like something, you get some of your friends and you go outside and you make a lot of noise and you demonstrate against it, right? Well, they did that. That was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was very common. They had holidays that they set aside just to riot. They did, right? And they even had days where all the men were dressed like women and all the women were dressed like men. Turn the world upside down, so to speak. The colonial leaders didn't want to oppose it because they saw it as an outlet for their anger. But they had this tradition of coming together and acting in unison. Well, the destruction of the tea was an essential rejection of British authority. We're not going to play, right? But it also says you can't play either. And that's really what they were doing. The Tea Party involved a relatively broad segment of the population, even though this is an era when the elites make decisions. You had to be properly bred, you had to be wealthy enough, and you had to own land if you were going to make a decision in the colony. Well, they kind of stepped over all that. Right? They were going to do this themselves. Because of this, the destruction set a world standard for future democratic protest. Not just here in America, but a lot of other countries, they say, yeah, but what about the Boston Tea Party? And you hear it in Europe, you hear it in South America, you hear it. People say, no, we can do this. We can oppose what we see as wrong. Well, from the British perspective, the Boston Tea Party was the culmination of a decade's worth of flawed imperial policy. We've ignored the colonies too long. We let them get away with all this. Now look at that. The upstarts think it's their right. So they really thought we were crazy for trying to do this. Well, the event played a part in this imperial legacy. It was a challenge to the British Crown. To Americans, the Tea Party became an emblem of their faith that a determined and organized group can accomplish momentous political change, culminating in independence. Not everyone believed it yet, but it was headed in that direction. The participants were men who showed their willingness to defy the law in defense of their rights. To this day, journalists, pundits, politicians frequently cite the Tea Party as the first and most famous example of America's heritage of civil disobedience. It was becoming part of our society. The day after the Tea Party, there was a famous attorney and future president, John Adams. He called it, and I quote, the most magnificent movement of all. He went on and said, the dignity, a majesty in this last effort of the patriots. He says, this I greatly admire. And he was pretty staid, he was pretty conservative. Not everyone agreed, though. Some found the story of the Tea Party to be inspiring, even democratic, some said.